Building a family can be a complicated, messy, lonely, and sometimes heartbreaking process. But you don't have to navigate this challenging journey alone. Welcome to the All Paths podcast, where we support and celebrate all of the different ways there are to try to grow your family. We're your hosts, Emily, Lauren, and Leanne from the nonprofit organization All Paths Family Building. And today we're talking with Dana Rudolph about her journey and her work in this space. Dana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into your story, we'd love for you to just briefly introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. I am Dana Rudolph. I am the founder and publisher of Mombian, which is a blog and resource website for LGBTQ parents. And my spouse and I have our own son who has graduated from college and is gainfully employed. And we're very happy to see him on his way and to have been part of this parenting journey.
Great. Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey to starting a family? Where did it all begin?
Sure. My now spouse, we weren't allowed to officially marry for some years. My now spouse and I, Helen, met, 33 years ago. And for the first 10 years, I'd say, of our relationship, we were pretty focused on finishing grad school, starting our careers, but eventually decided to start a family. And I think pretty early on, we decided we wanted to pursue what is now known as reciprocal IVF. So one of us contributes an egg, the other one carries it. We use donor sperm. So we're both connected to the child in different ways, but ones that we felt worked for us. I was a little younger. My spouse really wanted the experience of pregnancy, so we used my eggs and she carried. It was a complex experience. IVF is more complicated than simple donor conception, and reciprocal IVF is even more complicated because you have to sync both of your cycles and testing on both people and all of that. But even in the early aughts, we found a way. And then we had to go through a lot of legal rigmarole because I would not at the time have been considered a legal parent in New Jersey where we were living. So we also found a lawyer to help us through that. I decided I didn't want to do a co-parent adoption of the child because I didn't want to be adopting my own genetic son. I thought that was ridiculous. And so the lawyer helped us petition for a pre-birth parentage order instead of an adoption, but because it was a court order, it is just as legally binding. We thought we were going to be the first in the state to do it, but another couple was actually doing the same thing, and I think they were first by a month or so. But we were clearly part of a trend, and happy to be jumping on that and to have the legal protection from the moment of our son's birth, because adoption obviously doesn't happen immediately. You need to file the paperwork, and it can be several months when there's a gap and the child is only legally connected to one parent. So if something happens, then there's a risk.
Right.
So that was it in a nutshell. And, I think we were an early reciprocal IVF family, but not one of the first. And actually, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, because if you search online, you'll find many sources that say that reciprocal IVF started in 2007, 2010. And we started in 2002. And I actually did some research showing that it was in existence at least as early as 1995, because there was a lawsuit involving two women who did it.
Yeah. Well, that brings up an interesting question. I think there's so much to talk about here. There's both the legal path and things that you've learned and talked about. And I would love to hear a little bit more about, where you see this, where we are today and where this is going and how we got here. But I'm also curious because IVF in itself, it can be a difficult and hard process, and the technology is always changing. What was it like for you during that time to find clinics to work with, to understand the medical procedures? How was that for you?
I guess my main image was of a giant paper grocery bag full of medications that we brought home
Yes.
from the pharmacy. We were lucky in that we lived in New Jersey, which was a pretty welcoming state. I mean, this was pre-marriage equality, pre a lot of the visibility and understanding that has happened since then.
Mm.
But Jersey was one of the states, I think, that was on the leading edge of that. So we pretty quickly found a clinic that was willing to do it. We started with our GP, and then they referred us to a clinic that had experience with same-sex couples. So that went pretty well. And we even formed a little support group with some other queer families who were going to the same clinic, and we met once a week and just chatted and supported each other. So our experience was positive, although I know that's not the case for everyone at that time or even now.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the challenges that you remember? I mean, certainly you talked about the legal ramifications, but were there other challenges that stick out to you?
Lots of needles.
Lots of needles.
With reciprocal IVF, I needed to give myself injections to harvest the eggs all at once, right? Because usually you only release one a month, but they wanted to harvest a bunch at a time, so I took special medicines for that. And I had to go on birth control for the first time in my life in order to have a child, which I always think was funny. And that was to sync my cycle with Helen's.
Right.
So there was just a lot of coordination about the process. And then, of course, she had her own medications to prepare her uterus to be ready. And she actually had the worst injection. Mine were with little teeny needles. She had to have a very large one for the final medication there. So that was challenging. Deciding on a donor was challenging. We did have the advantage of being able to go online and search. I think we were sort of the first generation of people to be doing that, as opposed to getting, printouts to look through. And we did try once and have a chemical pregnancy pretty soon thereafter. The second try worked. So that was good. We were lucky enough that my employer paid for it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think in some ways we had an advantage because they hadn't had experience with too many reciprocal IVF couples before. And I basically said, "You're not going to discriminate against us and turn this down, are you?"
Exactly.
They agreed. So I think they paid for everything but the sperm.
Did you have family support, friend support? How was the community around you when you talked about the process and what decisions you were making and what you were going through?
We absolutely had family support on both of our sides of the family. My family was geographically closer, so we were more in touch with them. And our son was also the first grandchild on that side of the family. So I think that there was extra enthusiasm. We didn't tell my parents until after we got pregnant, just because we didn't want to get their hopes up. So I'd say we didn't have the support through the conception process, but that was only because they didn't know. And after that, they were definitely very excited and supportive of us. Yeah, and then Helen had the most boring pregnancy ever until the last 2 minutes when she needed an emergency C-section. So that was a challenge as well. But all is good. Everyone was fine. And here we are today.
You are today. Again, what was the pregnancy like for you?
It was good. My spouse had always wanted the experience of being pregnant. It was a little funny because she has short hair, has a little more of a, masculine gender appearance. Although she identifies as a woman, but just, I think a lot of people assume that because I'm the one who looks more feminine, I would be the one who was pregnant. And that wasn't the case and isn't always the case. But, we had to correct some people whom we told we were having a child and assumed I was the one carrying until she started to show, and then it was more obvious.
An important lesson in not making assumptions.
Yes. No, I think especially because we did RIVF, I felt connected to the process. Having said that, I don't think RIVF is necessary for a non-gestational parent to feel connected. But that was our experience, and
Yeah.
it felt right for me.
What about your conversations with your son? Do you remember sort of when you made the decision on what you were going to say, how you were going to say it? How did those conversations unfold?
I think we were both in agreement from the start that we would be absolutely open with him about it. I think with queer parents in particular, there's not a sense of needing to be secretive about it because, assisted reproduction is often the only option we have other than adoptions. So there's obviously some explanation that's needed in there. And so we always wanted to tell him. I honestly don't even remember when the first time was, because it was a series of conversations with different bits of information at each stage as he was interested and ready for it. And, we just explained that to create a baby, you need a special cell from a woman and a special cell from a man. And when there's not a man in the family, we work with, someone called a donor who's agreed to provide those cells to families like ours. And our son just absorbed it, and that was just his family. He hasn't known anything different. So I would definitely recommend bringing up the process early, but also not overwhelming with too much information too early. Yeah. And there are happily now a number of books that can help. We didn't have those available to us, so we were kind of making it up. But he seems pretty well adjusted now, so I'm assuming we did it well enough.
It sounds like you did a great job, and that's such a good advice, to have a series of conversations and just have it be as normalized as possible. Like, this is the story of our family. Here are bits and pieces of what that means, and we can just keep revisiting it instead of having one massive, intense conversation, right?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned there was that court order for parentage before birth. Were there any other steps or barriers that you faced around parentage?
Not around parentage. Because that was a court order, it was legally binding and gets full faith and credit in all states. And I always say, same-sex couples, even if they're now married and on their kid's birth certificate, most of the LGBTQ legal experts I speak with recommend doing a co-parent adoption or a court order. In some states, you can do something called a voluntary acknowledgement of parentage. And these are all considered court orders and therefore recognizable in all states, which may or may not be the case if you're just married, in case something ever happens to marriage equality. So that, I guess that was the only big legal thing. We did have to pay unequal taxes for a number of years until legal marriage was an option for us. When one of us was staying home with our child, we were on the other person's healthcare insurance, and that was taxable if we weren't married. So there were, there were some financial issues because of the lack of marriage equality, but that wasn't parentage per se.
Right.
I guess the only other thing I'll mention is that Helen was the one who was pregnant, and she stayed home with our son for the first 6 months or so. She was nursing, and that just made the most sense. But then there were some changes organizationally at the company I was working at, and I decided to look for another job. And so we both decided to throw resumes out there and see who would get the better offer. It turned out she did. So I ended up being the one staying home with our child for the bulk of his younger years. Certainly queer families are not the only ones who have that flexibility, but I think in some ways there are less traditional expectations on us. So it felt very easy for us to access that flexibility, and I hope that more families of all types will consider that as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really, really good point. Do you think that the space has changed for LGBTQ families since you started your own journey? Do you see some positive or potentially negative trends?
Yes, I mean, certainly the overall trend since the early 2000s has been positive, not only with marriage equality, but also in specific parentage laws in many states that are more inclusive of all families formed via assisted reproduction, not just LGBTQ families, but also including us. So that's a good thing. I think there are more fertility clinics that are welcoming and knowledgeable about our needs, which is great. At the same time, I do think there's been a backsliding in the past few years because of many things. The federal government certainly has taken steps to be more restrictive and to push back on LGBTQ rights generally. But I think this is also something we're seeing in a lot of states. So it has gotten harder, but I think overall there's been progress. Whether or not the progress remains, I think, is an open question. And I guess the other thing I should mention is that there's also been a great increase in representation. One of the things I do on my website is I try to review every LGBTQ inclusive kids book for ages 0 to 12. And I have a database that I've built so you can search by topic and identity. And I built this because, gosh, in about 2017, a couple of years past marriage equality, when the publishing industry had caught up, there was a huge spike in the number of LGBTQ inclusive kids books. Before that, I could probably count the number each year on one hand. And after that, there have been hundreds in the past few years. So I built the database to allow myself and other parents who are seeking these types of books a way to find them. And there's books about all kinds of families now and about kids who are themselves LGBTQ. There are books that are about being LGBTQ, but there are also books that simply show LGBTQ families engaged in any number of activities. And it's been really great to see that range flourish. But you ask if things have changed negatively. And of course, we're seeing now a sweeping surge of book bans and restrictions across the country. And that's not great.
Yeah.
Not at all. And at Alpass, we're very committed to pro-family building advocacy and legislation, but we're always reading the fine print on these definitions of, who's included in these benefits or coverage. The language now is very strategic in some cases to be, excluding potentially those that are not hetero and married and, what some consider to be the only acceptable family structure to have assistance, which of course we don't endorse, but that's something that we're tracking in our region, but also federally, and making sure that all individuals and all families, no matter how they're structured, have access to the care they need to build their families. So it's on our minds all the time, and I imagine even more so for
I mean,
you.
it was great to see that the American Society for Reproductive Medicine changed its definition of infertility a few years ago to include people who are infertile because they are with a partner with whom they can't get pregnant because they have the same gametes, right? So that's carried over, I think, now into a few more states, and I think it was Aetna that recently changed its definition to be more inclusive as well. So there's progress in some areas, even as there's pushback in other places and regions.
Yes, we're playing offense and defense right now.
I think it's offense, defense, and education, because I think to a lot of people, they hear some of the debates that are going on, and at surface level, they might have a certain opinion. It's when you dig down into, as you mentioned, Lauren, those deep, fine details to say, who is this really protecting and including? Right. And I think it's, all of us as a community, our job to continue to educate and point out exactly what these new bills, legislation, and rules really mean.
Right. And if we don't give sweeping access that's specific and inclusive, then we leave these loopholes open to allow discrimination voluntarily. And that is something we don't want to see. And we'll continue to advocate against. But you mentioned when your son was 2, that's when you started thinking about Mombian or thinking about what you wanted to do in the space to create something
Yes,
you didn't have. Can you tell us more about
sure,
that
sure.
process? And
So my professional background was in internet strategy and marketing, and blogging had
oh, wow.
fairly recently become a thing. So while I was home with him when he was younger, I also wanted to do a little something to keep up my professional skills. And I saw a need because the LGBTQ websites at the time weren't covering parenting, and the parenting websites weren't covering LGBTQ families except maybe once a year at Pride. So I saw an opportunity to create a website that had news and information, commentary, life through a queer parent's lens. And I knew I didn't want it to be a diary type blog of my own family because, as I said, we didn't have that many issues or concerns. It was kind of a boring story, and no one really cares what my son had for breakfast. And I also wanted to protect his privacy and let his story be his to tell as he got older. That was how I felt about it. I know other people feel differently in terms of sharing more of their family stories, but that's what felt right for me at the time. And so I launched the site as kind of a news and information site, but also with kind of a personal touch and personal commentary as well. And it has grown through the years. I've launched the book database as part of it. I've had the honor of winning 2 GLAAD Media Awards for it, which was quite touching. I'm sort of humbled that my side gig while I was a stay-at-home parent has taken off in the way that it did and gotten such recognition. So and now it'll be 21 years that I've had it in just a few weeks.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
How has Mombian evolved over the years? Like you said, it started as this like little side project. Did you ever envision that it would become the resource that it is today?
No, not at all. I'm not sure I had a particular end goal other than to be useful for people and to offer insights and readings that at the time weren't available elsewhere. And I think that's changed a little bit in terms of who's covering LGBTQ parenting. I'd like to think that after doing it for 20 years, I have some sense of the history and the nuances of a lot of the issues that I still bring to the table. I think my pieces have gotten a little more in depth. At the time when I started it, there was no social media per se. So I think I did a lot of short form posts that now are things that I tend to do on some of the other social media more than on my blog itself. And also from the blog, I've spun off a newspaper column that runs in some of the LGBTQ papers around the country. And those are more sort of in-depth, thought-out pieces on various topics from parenting to parenting-related politics to book reviews. So I think that's one way that it's evolved. And the book database is certainly another. That's something that I spend a lot of time on and that I've heard is useful for people because you can't just go to the library and look up LGBTQ kids books and find them because not every book has cataloging information that indicates when there's LGBTQ representation. And it's not always clear from the book blurbs, especially if the book isn't about LGBTQ identities per se. So I spent a lot of time searching for those books and reading review copies and seeing if there is in fact queer representation there.
Do people send you books all the time? Are you inundated with requests?
I'm on a lot of publishers' book lists right now or mailing lists right now. So yes, I think luckily most of the review copies I get recently are digital because my bookshelves were getting full there for a while. Now I can just take the PDF and read it.
That's good.
So that's great.
And that's such an amazing resource for families.
Yeah, and it's really gratifying to see not just that there are inclusive books, but that some of them are really good books. There are some I think that stand up against any kids literature out there. And I think our families deserve quality books just like anyone else. So it's great to see books that are, a good read and well illustrated and just a lot of fun for kids, as well as providing the important representation.
So when did you come up with the idea for LGBTQ Families Day? Was that at the same time as you were creating Mombian? Did one inspire the other? Can you share a little bit about that?
Mombian certainly inspired LGBTQ Families Day. It actually started out as blogging for LGBTQ Families Day in the year after I launched the blog. And initially, I had asked people with other LGBTQ parent blogs to blog for LGBTQ families on that day. And I created a master list to share all of those posts with everyone else. And again, that was before Facebook and Instagram and, the other social media. Over the years, it evolved into more of a hashtag campaign and just an identity day like any of the other ones that we now celebrate. I did choose the date very intentionally. It's the first weekday of June, which is the start of Pride, but it's also halfway between Mother's Day and Father's Day, more or less. And so it sort of honors both. It's in that parental holiday season, but it also acknowledges that not every family fits into that structure of one mom and one dad.
Right.
So I encourage everyone to post in support and celebration of LGBTQ families on June 1st this year, and to use the hashtag LGBTQ Families Day, and then to follow it to see who else is sharing and posting about us. I think it's great now that social media has enabled so many more people to share about their experiences as LGBTQ parents and as children of LGBTQ parents, grown children of LGBTQ parents, sharing their stories. But I still think there's a need to stop and celebrate ourselves and our families, and to remember the joy as well as the challenges that we now have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Is there anything else you'd like to share about Mombian?
Well, I hope people will come and have a read of what's going on. I have a mix of content every week. Sometimes it's covering a piece of political news. Sometimes it's a political win, even in this day and age. There are some states that have seen very positive legislation recently, so I'll look at that. I will take book reviews from my database and often round them up in a summary post on the main blog. I also do roundups of other LGBTQ parenting news and stories. So if you're not out on the internet every day looking for them like I am, you can come and have sort of a list of some important ones or some interesting ones to read, to keep in touch. And I also like to shout out queer parents who are doing cool things in the world. For example, the captain of the Ottawa Charge is a queer mom, so that's kind of exciting, even though I'm a Boston Fleet fan. But the Fleet have a queer mom on their team too, Jamie Lee Rattray. So it's been fun to see the queer parents out in the world, not only raising their families, but also balancing work and life, and some really nice achievements.
Yes, important to share all those good things.
I like to give them a shout out and just to remind people that we do exist, and a lot of us have kids who are doing well, and even when they're not, it's not because we're LGBTQ, it's because people are people, So.
Exactly.
I think that's something that gets lost in the conversation a lot. No, we were talking with a guest a couple of weeks ago who is an adoptee who then became an adopted father. And then he was saying about, people build up this whole narrative with adoptees that, they struggle and they have such a hard time with X, Y, and Z. And he's like, maybe like when I was a kid, I was like, who am I? But what teenager isn't like that? I think, what you're talking about, it's the same thing. There's all of these narratives that kind of people place on top of different types of families saying, oh, this is why this person is struggling. This is why this kid is struggling. Like, no, we're struggling because we're humans. It doesn't matter what your background is, who your parents are, you're going to have challenges just because you're a person. And I think it's really unfair when people use one piece of your identity or one piece of your ecosystem to be like, oh, this is why you're struggling.
Yeah. And I think, I've seen some LGBTQ parents feel the pressure to be perfect parents. And that pressure trickles
Yes.
down to their kids, because they don't want to reflect badly on the LGBTQ community. I've heard people of other marginalized identities say the same thing, but it's just what you said. It's
Mhm.
it's an assumption about a group of families and a pressure that we shouldn't have, and that we certainly shouldn't place on our kids. We are just as flawed as anyone else. No more so, but certainly no less so.
Have you seen sort of a movement or increase in children of LGBTQ families start to sort of speak and talk more, create groups, share their experiences, and then help to sort of move things in the right direction for that next generation?
Absolutely. There's an organization called COLAGE that was founded back in 1990, I believe, and is specifically for people with one or more LGBTQ parents. And they provide networking and support and a number of great resources for specific things like being, donor conceived with LGBTQ parents or having trans parents. And they are also doing a lot of advocacy work around parentage legislation, around legislation involving donor conception, which I think that there's certainly a movement now for more transparency in donor conception, but there are also issues that raises in terms of how that connects to the legality of non-gestational, non-genetic parents in LGBTQ families because of our particular legal issues. So they're in there representing and testifying about why we need the legislation, but also how to shape it so that it really does protect people in all kinds of families.
Yeah. They're doing some wonderful work. And again, normalizing that, like, hey, there's so many different ways to be a family, and there are so many awesome humans in this world because of all of those families.
Right. You may remember back in 2011, a young man named Zach Walls went viral on YouTube for speaking up in the Iowa legislature during the marriage equality battles, talking about his life growing up with two moms. He's now, I think, a two-term state representative in Iowa and running for U.S. Senate. So.
Oh, that's awesome! I didn't know he was running for the Senate now.
Yes.
That's spectacular.
So yes. I said he was a representative. I think he's a state senator running now for U.S. So
nice.
Yeah, and so he's been speaking up for our families since he was a teen, and I think those voices are very important. As parents, we have a certain perspective, but I think the voices of our kids and our kids when they're old enough to to make the decision for themselves to speak up. I'm not talking about the very young ones, but certainly our older children, our grown children, they have a hugely important perspective, and they have to be heard in these conversations because they will show that they're doing just fine, and they would have done even better perhaps had they had the support and the representation and all of these things that we are now fighting for.
Definitely. So Dana, there are two questions that we like to ask every guest of ours as we're wrapping up. So if I could start with question one, what's one thing that you would say to someone just starting to grow their family?
Tell you what, I will aim this specifically at LGBTQ families, although I think it may apply more broadly, but
sure.
Speak from my experience here. I would say to remember that we've been doing this for a really long time. There's this sense that we're kind of a newfangled thing. And queer families go back to just after World War II, and certainly ones who are intentionally trying to create families together go back to the 70s. If you want to kick it back even farther, Sappho, in theory, had a child, according to some interpretations of the source material. So I like to think of her as the first queer parent. But even in the modern sense, it's been decades. And there is experience, there are role models, there is information out there, and you're not alone in this at all.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
So I'll ask the next question. How can someone show up for a friend or family member who is potentially struggling to build their family right now?
Well, I think it's just what you said, to show up and to let them know that you are there for them. I think it's also important to avoid kind of over hopeful platitudes like it'll just take time or I'm sure you'll do it, because you can't know that. And I think that can sometimes feel hollow and a little grating. So I think letting them know that you're there and willing just to listen. And maybe that's the real advice is just be there to listen to what they have to say, if they need to vent, if they have specific questions that you can answer based on your experience, obviously do that. But really just let them know that you are there in any way that they need you to be.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
So, is there anything either about your own story or the work that you do that you wanted to share that we haven't asked about yet?
I think we've covered quite a lot of it. I would say queer parenting certainly has its share of challenges, and sometimes that's what gets highlighted in the media, and rightly so. We need to learn about those challenges and learn how to overcome them or to create social change to overcome them. But there are also so many joys. And that's what I try to balance in what I'm doing at Mombian is to talk about the issues and the concerns, but also just to show families being families and queer parents and our kids doing interesting things in the world because we are part of the world. And if I can find that balance and showcase that, then I hope I'm being both kind of practically supportive, but also emotionally supportive of people as well. And they need to be confident and ultimately happy and joyous in our families because that's really what it's all about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dana. We're so grateful that you joined us today, and we're so grateful for the work that you're doing. It's incredible work. Our community is benefiting from Mombian, and so many families like yours and others are so lucky to have this resource. So thank you for everything that you're doing and for speaking to us about it today.
And thank you for all that you do in these times, helping us to build families and to learn more about family building and just all of the support you bring is so vital. And it's so wonderful to see an organization that's not necessarily focused on LGBTQ families, but that is fully inclusive of us. So that is noticed and appreciated.
That really means a lot.
Glad to
Thank
hear
you.
that. It's very important to us.
No, I really enjoyed the conversation, Dana. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week with more family building stories and resources. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And follow us on social media at allpathsfb or visit our website allpathsfb.org to learn more about our work. And please help spread the word so that anyone who is struggling to grow their family can join the conversation. All Paths Family Building is so grateful to the members of our circle of support. And today, we want to recognize and thank Rainbow sponsor Granada Bio. Your partnership is vital to our ability to provide emotional support, education, and advocacy that is open to anyone who is struggling to grow their family. And to the entire All Paths community, thank you for being here. It's an honor to walk with you on your journey.